Mark Spencer, the Conservative MP for Sherwood. You're now a minister in the Department of Fisheries and Food and Agriculture. I want to start this interview by talking to you about your time as Chief Whip under Boris Johnson. It was a turbulent time. When MPs are rebelling or they're angry about gatherings in Number 10, what is the personal toll that that takes on an individual who is in the Chief Whip's role?
Yeah, so I think clearly not as much as there is pressure on the Prime Minister, but I suppose I look back at that time and reflect. Boris came in as Prime Minister, he got Brexit to deal with, and to be fair, he dealt with that very quickly. But none of us knew that COVID was about to hit us or a war in Ukraine. And, you look back and you think, well, what a privilege it was to be part of that, at the centre of the whirlwind, if you like, during that political turmoil. Huge global challenges facing the country, and I'm quite proud to have been part of that government dealing with those huge challenges.
Did you ever have any sleepless nights? Were there particular strains on you?
I think clearly you think about it all the time, and you think about how you can affect the world around you and how you can make it a better place. But I've always been a fairly laid-back person and fairly relaxed. I think you just need to try and deal with it as you go along. But we've got a cabinet that was sharing that responsibility. We've got a Prime Minister that was gripping it, pretty robustly. And I think it's worth looking back. People criticised Boris, particularly around what happened over COVID, but no one ever went without a ventilator in this country. You look at other countries in Europe, the Italians, the Germans, the Spanish were really struggling to get ventilator capacity. That never happened in the UK. We were the very first to roll out the vaccine. That was all due to Boris driving this thing right from the centre.
And actually, Boris Johnson nearly was put on a ventilator. That must have been such an anxious time.
So that genuinely was quite a moment. I can remember Mark Sedwell ringing to say
that's the head of the civil
service ringing and to say there'll be a cabinet call in 15 minutes. It's important that you're on that call. And he said, I need to tell you that the Prime Minister has been taken into intensive care. And suddenly it sort of hits you that, wow, this is serious. And Dom Raab, to his credit, stepped up and held the fort while Boris was recovering. But thank goodness he got through it. And
talk us through the process of when members of Parliament, your own side, the people that you're in charge of ensuring the vote the right way, when there is a problem and you think, I am not going to get this vote through, or this rebellion is too big. What point do you tell the Prime Minister that?
Yeah, so it's a slow boil process, if you like. So rewind. I need to know, as Chief Whip, as Government Chief Whip, I need to know what makes my colleagues tick, what stimulates them, what they want to achieve, and you achieve that by getting to know them personally. Because obviously, I want to get them re-elected. I want them to win the next general election. I need to know what their priorities are, so that when a new policy comes forward from an individual department, I will know those individuals that I think may have a challenge with this or will have a view on it. And you can then reach out very early to say, look, this is what we're thinking of doing. How do you feel? Do you want to sit down with the minister? And so there's a very slow process to get to the point where someone may well disagree. And even at that point, you can then do quite a lot to try and placate them, accommodate them, and make it work. And of course, that's a lot easier if you've got an 80-seat majority like Boris achieved, because you can then say to that individual, maybe you'd like to go and work in your constituency on that day, rather than put yourself in the awkward position where you don't want to support this policy.
And for future generations or historians, when you look back on your role as Chief Whip, is there anything you regret about how you performed that role, or anything that could have been done differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can always reflect on what you could have done or should have done. But I think, on the whole, when you look back at what that administration achieved in delivering the vaccine, in getting Brexit done, in dealing with the challenges that we faced as a nation, the millions and millions of pounds that they poured in we have into the NHS, I think actually you can look back with a degree of pride at what the government was able to achieve.
You would have been subject or witnessed to both probably some angry Conservative MPs during when the Partygate, it just wouldn't go away for weeks, for months, daily negative news stories about what went on in Number 10 during lockdown. Do MPs take that out on the Chief Whip when they're angry?
So, I mean, I think that's one of the roles of the Chief Whip and the Whip's office, to absorb that, to make sure that they understand what is driving colleagues and what keeps them awake at night and what their concerns are. That is one of the fundamental roles of the Whip's office, to absorb that information, to then communicate that to Downing Street. And I'd always say to colleagues, I'd much rather you came into my office and shouted at me and told me how angry you were than go on GBNews and do it. Let's keep those conversations internal. I'll try and accommodate you and help you and get to the bottom of what is making you so grumpy, as long as we can do that internally rather than, externally. Was
there a moment when you realised it was not recoverable for Boris Johnson, that his leadership was done?
So, I mean, you should never write Boris Johnson off. I think we wouldn't be the first people to sit here and say, Boris is time to write Boris off, because if you look back, everybody said he could never become Mayor of London, and he did it. And then they said, well, you'll never get re-elected. You look at the polls. The polls are telling you'll never get re-elected, and he did it. You'll never solve Brexit, Boris. The Theresa May government was completely paralysed. There's nothing you can do, Boris, to solve this problem, and he did it. I think you write Boris Johnson off at your peril. He is a hugely, hugely talented politician. Was it a mistake to get rid of Boris Johnson? Well, I think clearly that was a decision that he made to go. I think now we've got Rishi in as Prime Minister. I think Rishi is the man for the moment. He clearly is a very credible, bright, driven individual who's fizzing with policy ideas. I think Rishi is the man of this moment. That doesn't mean to say that Boris has not got a big role in politics, in UK politics in the future. So you think that we could still see Boris Johnson at some point in the future in a leading role in British politics? Well, so what I would say to you is that he is a man of huge talent, that my constituents love and respect him, that as a party we'd be very foolish to not make the most of those talents that clearly he has as an individual. Sleaze, sexism and bullying, they exist in society. They exist in Parliament too. What needs to change? So I think we've made some changes, actually. We have made some progress in the right direction. What is absolutely fundamental is that those who are victims have got the confidence to come forward, that they feel as though if they make an allegation, that allegation will be taken seriously, will be investigated properly, and they've got the confidence to come forward. We made a few changes in that direction. So, for example, now it is possible to make an anonymous complaint. That will be logged. How do you do that? Through the independent body? That's right, through the independent. And there are little cards everywhere all over Parliament which people can pick up in the toilets, in the tea room, in the library, where people can go and make those contacts. So if, for example, someone comes forward and says, look, I don't want to make a formal complaint, but MP A, I think acted inappropriately, and I just want to log that. I don't feel I've got enough for a formal complaint. And then somebody else comes forward about the same MP, and then somebody else. It's then possible for that authority to go back to those three individuals and go, look, you need to know that you're not on your own here, that someone else has made a similar allegation, and that demonstrates a pattern of behaviour which you might want to consider now making a formal complaint so it can be investigated properly. Now, you've got to do that as delicately as possible, of course, because we're dealing with people's reputations and you don't want people to make false allegations, but victims absolutely have to feel confident that they'll be taken seriously if they make an allegation. Can you recall a time when you were Chief Whip that you had to deal with a wrong 'un, perhaps like a criminally wrong 'un? So I mean, I've had both extremes actually. Where there was a very, very serious criminal allegation, well, two, one of which clearly they were guilty and were sent to prison, and the other one where the person who'd had the allegation made against them was found to be completely innocent. And so you have to deal with both of those allegations in the same way. And if an MP has been accused of
something of a sexual nature, something very serious, should they be allowed to come onto the parliamentary estate while that is being investigated?
What we don't want to do is end up in a circumstance where, I could quite easily make an allegation against Ed Davey, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak tomorrow and wipe the three of them out of the parliamentary process by making a false allegation. That would be clearly would be wrong. But it is very difficult because you're not dealing with employees. MPs are not employees. They are advocates. They are representatives of their constituents. So the power lies with the constituents to get rid of them. But of course, if someone's made a very, very serious allegation about inappropriate behaviour within a parliamentary office, it's then very difficult for that person to keep coming into the parliamentary office, working with an individual that may have made the allegation against them, which is why the Speaker has pulled together this committee to look at those contradictions, if you like. And
what about when it's not of a criminal nature, but I don't know, perhaps somebody's making an offensive remark?
Yeah. So we should all call that out, shouldn't we? We should call it out immediately. And I think we've got a responsibility as members of Parliament to do that. So I think you have to say, so you're stood in Strangers Bar, you overhear someone say something that is clearly wrong. You have to go, well, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I just heard what you said and that was wrong. You should not have said that. You should apologise for what you just said because you clearly caused offence to that individual and call it out there and then. And you don't have to do that in an aggressive way, but I think you then start to change that culture slowly by calling it out there and then. And other people should then step in and go, actually, he was right. You shouldn't have said that.
Do you think the fact that you mentioned the Strangers Bar, which is sort of like there are many bars, that's sort of like a pub type of bar in the Commons, does that play a part? Do you think the number of drinking establishments?
So, alcohol is a fact of life, I'm afraid. And if you don't have a facility for members of staff at the end of the day, when they've finished their work, to go and have a beer together and to socialise, then they'll go off-site and do it, or they'll drink in their offices behind closed doors. Now, I put it to you, actually, you're probably in a much safer environment where there are journalists and other members of the public and civil servants around. That's actually, it's a fairly healthy place to go and have a quiet drink. Now, of course, there'll be examples of where people have taken that to extreme and they've got an issue with alcohol.
I think many people would be surprised, actually, at the drinking culture. I would say not most MPs, but there are definitely occasions, I'm not painting myself as an angel in this either, of going through the lobbies drunk, voting on issues with, a skinful inside you.
I've not seen that very often, to be honest. It's not, I think there's a danger that we overpaint this as a problem. I don't see there's an issue with people having a quiet drink with a few mates at the end of the day when you've finished your work. Clearly, you don't want colleagues to be drinking excessively at lunchtime and then having to deal with constituents. But that's judgments that MPs should be able to make for themselves without the authorities getting involved.
And to go to your current brief, fisheries, your fisheries minister, it's in your responsibility list. The great British Chippy.
Yeah.
It's having a blooming tough time right now. We've got Chippy's closing. It's no longer a cheap meal. How do we save the British chip shop?
Well, I think you can make the same argument about the high street, to be honest, as well. It's not just fish and chip shops. There are lots of those shops are under pressure. Now, the fundamental answer, the direct answer is you've got to use them, otherwise you'll lose them. If you don't use your fish and chip shop, it will disappear because it won't have the trade to be able to continue. I always say to people, use your fish and chip shop because it's a great British tradition, and stick a few mushy peas on the side as well.
Mark Spencer, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.